Before that, I was involved in the world of bike advocacy, and that's where I met Albert. Really happy to hear this news. I heard it near the end that you were working on this book, and now it's here. I'm very honored to be one of the locations to help launch and get the book out there. So with that, I'll hand it over to Albert, and let me know if you need more images.
Perfect. Okay. So I should, thank you very much to Fred and to Fix Coffee and Bikes. And I should tell you that I should begin by saying that Fred actually wrote one of the most influential reports in the history, and now I know the history, I'm going to talk about it, the history of cycling in Toronto. And in fact, when we were advocating for bike lanes, always the bane of the existence of the cycling advocate was parking. So Fred worked with TCAT, Toronto Coalition for Active Transportation at the time, wrote a report that showed, because businesses said, we can't survive without parking. So he wrote a report for Bloor Street, which found that what percentage of people arrived at local shops by car? 10%. So 90% arrived by walk, cycle, transit, and cyclists and people on foot spent the most and visited the most often. So it is clearly one of the most influential reports, and I'll just tell you a quick anecdote. I was sitting in a cafe in my neighborhood downtown, and there was a, the epilogue to that was that after that report was written, they did another study, and they found that 10% of people arrived by car, but 50% of the merchants arrived by car and then would park and take, of course, many of the parking spots of their customers. And the other, the subsequent report showed that, from that report, I remember sitting once in my neighborhood and seeing across the road a variety store where a car had been parked there for hours in front of the store. And variety stores generally don't like to lose their parking. So I went in and I said, I bought something, I said to the owner, wouldn't it be great if that car was restricted to like 15-minute parking? You'd get so much more business. And she said, that's my car. So of course, that kind of proved what the subsequent TCAT report told us. So I'm going to cycle quickly through three topics today.
No pun intended.
No. Three topics: bike licensing, bike ways, and bike speed. All of them are relevant today, and the contemporary issues, they keep popping up. And so I'm going to take you through that history. It's 130 years. So we'll go back to the bicycle craze. I do want to start and, of course, acknowledge the fact that our history, the land history, goes back much further. So I do want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional lands of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Chippewas. And this land is home to many First Nations, Métis and Inuit today. So I do want to take you first, to give you a bit of context, back to the beginning of the book was 1890s, which was the bicycle craze. And so that image shows you, that image takes you back a little bit to, think back to the excitement you felt as a child learning to ride a bike. Now that's the same excitement that existed in the 1890s. So just to give you a bit of context, in the 1890s, that's when the high wheel essentially was being replaced by what was called the safety. Not surprisingly called the safety because it had, you came down in altitude from that precarious seat on the high wheel. That was really only accessible to, it was mainly athletic people, daring people, it was men, and you needed a bit of money to buy a high wheel. So now all of a sudden you were closer to the ground. You had the chain drive and pneumatic tires. That was really key to the accessibility of the bicycle. And so this is a great ad from Massey Harris, which started making bikes in 1895 here in Toronto. And all the different people that rode bikes. There was like the vicar, there was the policeman chasing someone, there was a woman, there was a couple with a young child, maybe a bit dubious, where they had the child in the front handlebars. And all range of people that rode bikes. So that was the excitement in the bicycle craze in the 1890s. So some of the issues we talk about today were current then. So the first one that we'll talk about, the bicycle license. Of course, was all these new bicycles. There were 18,000 bicycles sold in Toronto in the 1895. There were bike shops, even the 80 bike shops. Drugstores and hardware stores got into the business as well because there was such a demand. And there were shops that sold clothing for riding clothing. There were all kinds of accessories. My favorite one were the safety pants. So these were pants you wore on the safety, but they had other things like odometers, lights, bells, and a bunch of different accessories. So someone came up with the idea, of course, the bicycle license. We have bicycles, we need licenses. But in those days, bicycle clubs like the Canadian Wheelmen's Association, the Toronto Bicycle Club were pretty powerful. So when people wanted to regulate cyclists, there was a lot of pushback, strong pushback from these clubs. And at the time, the bicycle license was part of regulation, but also thought of as a way of paying for either new roads or bicycle strips. That was big at the time, bicycle strips, just repairing a certain part of the road. But the bicycle groups, as I say, were quite strong, and they successfully pushed back against the bicycle license. So because of their power, they were able to resist. It was, the cycling clubs had a lot of affluent members. So when did the bicycle license get implemented then? Was in 1929, and who was cycling? Who predominated among cyclists at that time? Messengers were one, and number two were children, and often lower income groups. So that's when the City Hall decided we're going to implement the bicycle license. And Toronto had a prominent place in that story because they asked the province for the power to license cyclists. And the official reason in 1929 when they introduced the bicycle license was so that the police could return stolen bikes to the rightful owner. But you're right, that reason was forgotten pretty quickly. What it was really, what appealed to City Hall was they figured 30,000 bikes, that's quite a bit of money. And in fact, when they instituted the license, it was one of their big revenue streams. So almost one of the biggest next to dogs and cigarettes. Dogs and cigarettes were the only ones that really sort of surpassed that. And so they implemented that in 1929, and it lasted till 1956. So the sad part is a lot of kids, of course, were riding bikes. They certainly weren't the only ones, but children. So who were the cops often chasing when about the bicycle license? So as I like to put it, I mean, it was a lot easier to catch people who didn't have a bicycle license than it was to catch thieves. So that was always the theory. Well, we're going to reduce the amount of theft. Initially, the first year, because there wasn't much enforcement and there wasn't even a tag or anything associated with the license, they issued about 13,000 licenses in 1929. In 1934, when they started a stronger enforcement, that went up to about 29,000 licenses, quite a few. And during the war, that number went up to 40,000, over 40,000 licenses. So it gives us a good idea historically how much cycling activity there was. Remember, this is the city of Toronto that was less than a quarter of its size today. So a lot of cycling, and the police estimated in early 40s that there were 50,000 cyclists in Toronto based on the licensing. Many people didn't get a license because either they didn't think it was worthwhile or didn't want to. Initially, the license really served thieves well because it was easy to get one. So you stole a bike, you got a license, sold the bike, and that was served, as I say, the thief. The bicycle license then in 1956 was the last year of the bicycle license. And why was it canceled? There were three primary, and nobody remembered what the original reason was, but it was a nice revenue source. But by that time, the cost of the license had become very expensive, the administrative costs, and the cops really didn't enjoy chasing kids. Well, some did because they issued as many as 2,000 tickets during a year, often for not getting a license. And kids, here's the saddest part of the story. Because of the way the Juvenile Delinquents Act was a federal law, the way that was written, you actually were labeled a juvenile delinquent for being found guilty of not having a bicycle license. So we had all these juvenile delinquents, because what the law said is, if you don't get if you're convicted of a federal, provincial, or a municipal offense, you're then a juvenile delinquent. And so since that time, there have been various efforts to bring back licenses. Fortunately not successful. And the truth is, it probably will never come back because administratively, it would be quite a disaster. Recently, Councillor Diane Sachs wanted to bring it back for food couriers. We managed to convince her not to do that. And we said, license the companies. And surprisingly, she listened to that. So she was on the radio recently saying, we're going to try to license companies, but they need that authority from the province. So that's the first ride through bicycle license, and we're going to leave a lot of time for discussion. Number 2 issue, bikeways. So that's been an issue as well since the 1890s, because when all these people were riding bicycles, the question was, where are you going to ride the bicycles? And so the roads were very poor, and that was a big issue. So one of the places you could ride your bike relatively comfortably in many places was the Devil's Strip. Does anyone know what the Devil's Strip was?
Yeah.
Yes.
In between the two streetcars.
Yeah, that's right. So the Devil's Strip was between the streetcar lines. And remember, in the 1890s, we had electric streetcars already, quite an elaborate streetcar system. And so you could ride in the Devil's Strip, and there was an etiquette about it as well. If you were going southbound or you're going eastbound, then you had priority at that time. That was actually enshrined in the law. And the other place were bicycle strips. So we had a Mayor Robert Fleming. Where are we? Mayor Robert Fleming. Oh, if you can. Okay. Well, that's actually, so if you could stop there for a second, Fred. So here you see this guy here. Is a very healthy activity, bicycling and smoking a cigar. And he's got his license there on the chain stay in the back.
Not a delinquent.
What's that? He's not a delinquent, this guy. I think the picture's in 1944. So let's, yeah, you can go to the next slide as well. The one with the cartoon is kind of good as well.
Grandmother is too maybe.
Yeah, so that was a big issue then. Where are cyclists going to ride? Here's a great cartoon from 1896. And one of the big things were cinder paths, right? These are paths mainly outside of cities, but cinder paths were a real desire of many cyclists, including the clubs. There's something called the Inter-Club Association of Wheelmen. They were really big on the cinder paths. So this cartoon from Saturday night says, the woman says, and you see the bikes in the back, and you see how nicely dressed the woman was. So this was a way to be seen, was riding your bike. She says, poor Dick is gone. He was a devoted cyclist, wasn't he? And this fellow here, who I presume is a lawyer, says, yes, indeed. He left a will stating that he was to be cremated and used to help out our new cinder path. So it shows you the kind of excitement there was about cinder paths. And the Mail and Empire, they had a campaign for cinder paths, but officially, most of the cycling groups, they were against a different treatment for cyclists. They said, we want better roads. And the Canadian Wheelmen's Association, they emblazoned their membership cards with, we want good roads. That's what the official position was. We want good roads. I was mentioning Robert Fleming, the mayor in 1896, and the influence of cyclists. So he promised in 1896, he said, we're going to bring roads up to a good standard for cyclists, and where we can't, we'll put in a strip for bicyclists. So people were pretty excited about that, and presumably helped him win the election. And in fact, in a previous event we did, a woman told me that she's the great-granddaughter of Robert Fleming, who was called the People's Bob. So the People's Bob promised this, and the cycling groups got together and said, we should propose a cycling circuit, right? Which is exactly what they did in early 1896. Mayors were elected only for a year at the time. And they said, a cycling circuit, Bloor Street at the top, right? Bike lanes on Bloor, but it was just, it was part of that. So Bloor Street, and then Bathurst down to Richmond, Adelaide, across to Jarvis Street. Good idea, right? Jarvis Street. So that was 1896, a 10-mile circuit. But most of that didn't, so they were just talking about better roads, a combination of better roads and bicycle strips. But most of that didn't get built because, as I say, the leading cycling advocates, their position was, we want better roads, not special treatment from this. There was a bit of a rift then later on in the decade between cycling groups, and the Toronto group said we want these bicycle paths, and we want a commission set up to put in place a bicycle path. And this fellow who was the head of that group got chastised by the Canadian Wheelmen's Association that we're all about better roads for everyone. So moving forward just a little bit then, essentially we got better roads then, but eventually we also got a lot of cars. So the advantage of the better roads ended up working against cyclists. I'll cycle forward just a little bit to the early 1970s, the bicycle revival. Lots of people, what was the excitement around the bicycle revival? The 10-speed bike, that was really exciting. I remember when I was 10 years old, I got a 3-speed bike. And that was like 1970. I got a 3-speed bike, and we were really embarrassed to be seen with it, but it was actually a great bike. But it was just cool to have a 10-speed. What was the other thing? Environmental consciousness, energy crisis, fitness boom, all of those things were part of the bicycle revival. But the question was, where are people going to ride, right? And what happened is the motorists started getting concerned, all these bicycles in the way, so they thought, what are we going to do about these bicycles? So Metro Toronto, remember at the time, all of what's now Toronto was Metro Toronto, and then they said, we got a great idea, we're going to put bicyclists on trails, 440 kilometers of trails, there'd be kiosks on there, there'd be like stations, washrooms, and so on. Great idea, we'll get cyclists off the roads. That was the Metro idea. Walter Strock was the guy who proposed that. He was the consultant. He rode a bike every once in a while. It was his daughter's bike that he rode around. So he didn't have a lot of experience cycling. But they thought, great, people still think that. We'll put them on the trails. The city of Toronto, the old city, had a greater concentration of cyclists. And they said, we need to do a study about having bicycles on the roads. We want to keep them on the roads, and we want to do something about that. They did a study in 1978. They were really poised to put in bike lanes and so on. And then by the end of the report, after all this effort, it was a huge report, they said we're going to have wider curb lanes. That was the result. And part of that was because of the influence of what was coming from the US, that cyclists, the leading cycling advocates said, we want to be integrated with the traffic stream. We want to be equal to motorists. And John Forrester, who was sort of a bit of a messianic type, he said, you should not submit to this inferiority complex that you're somehow not as good as motorists. So he fought for that, very influential. He died just a couple of years ago. Huge influence about, he was against bike lanes. He said that was reflected this insecurity of cyclists, and we want cyclists on the road. So that was huge influence, and in 1979 we got one bike lane. Does anyone know where it is? Poplar Plains, 500 meters, 600 meters, all uphill, one way. It was the only bike lane that we had in the 1970s until 1991 or 1990. So that bike lane survived mainly because it was the residents of South Hill. It was a wealthy enclave. They loved the fact that it really calmed traffic, because it used to be called, Poplar Plains was known pejoratively as the Forest Hill Expressway. People racing 2 cars abreast up that road and then into Forest Hill. So we did start getting no bike lanes in the 1980s. Then Dan Egan, who was the manager of the cycling unit in Toronto, he went to Copenhagen, Velocity, and he was so impressed with all the bike lanes, and he was a vehicular cyclist. He supported that. He said, we're not going to get anywhere with this vehicular cycling thing. We need bike lanes. So then they did a report, they started putting in bike lanes in the 1990s, like College, Davenport, St. George, Beverly, streets like that. And then and that was going great. In the 1990s, Toronto, the old city, got a lot of bike lanes. And even Etobicoke, under Doug Holliday, got a bike lane on Royal York Road. Amazing. Remind Stephen Holliday of that. Remind Stephen Holliday of that. But that bike lane almost certainly survived because it was traffic calming, right? Traffic calming. It didn't really go anywhere, but it was traffic calming. So that was and then, of course, we had amalgamation, 1998. Toronto got subsumed in Metro Toronto, and sort of this, the car-centered thinking from Metro Toronto. We got the best bike plan, though, the 2001 bike plan. Shifting Gear was a fabulous bike plan, and on paper. In practice, we got about 8 kilometers a year, and got bike lanes on places like Steeles Avenue East. This is a place where there's still signs that say deer, you know, right? You have to watch out for deer. And those are the kind of bike lanes that we got. So terrible bike lanes. Since that time, and I'll skip to, we get to our next topic. Since that time, the bike plan really has faltered since the pandemic, when we got 30 kilometers of bike lanes, and since that time we've sped up the pace a bit. So since the pandemic, it's gotten a bit better. So we can chat a bit more about that. But then finally, I want to talk about something that Jim Jammer is going to have a question about: speed, right? So now today, speed is a topic again, largely because of electric bikes and the speed electric bikes can go at. In the 1890s, it was a big deal as well. Speed, because pedestrians complained, of course, about the fact that bikes were going so fast. Remember, at the time, we had electric streetcars that were limited to about 8 miles per hour. You had horses that could go as fast as the horse could, but not the long distances. Mostly people walking. So all of a sudden you had these bicycles that could go up to 20 kilometers an hour, and that was a big deal. A lot of people were anxious about that. Fast riders were called scorchers. And there was then a debate: we need to limit the speed. So for example, the Toronto Star had a survey: how about 6 miles per hour? The cyclists said, oh, it's such a great technology, why limit it to 10 miles per hour, right? The truth is, they could never agree on a number. And you might ask, how would they enforce something like that? Were you thinking about asking that? Yeah, so that's a good question. Remember, racing was really popular at the time, so you could measure sort of, a distance and see how long it took cyclists to get from one point to another. But most likely what happened is that, the police would just have eyeballed it, right? I know how fast the person walks, they're going twice as fast, therefore they must be going 6 miles per hour or something like that. It's not exactly a great solution, but people didn't say, we don't have any idea how fast we're going. So that was how it was resolved. Is they decided we're going to add to an existing bylaw a prohibition against immoderate riding. Immoderate, that's what it was called. And yeah, you can move forward, Fred, whatever next to you. So immoderate riding was banned. Of course, that was really prejudicial. That they didn't particularly like it. There's just an example of a bike license. That one's fine. Oh, here's just skipping back a little bit. So this is the kind of warning that people got early in the year every year. And so the fee at this time had gone up to $1. The fee had been 50 cents, but there was one year when the fine went up to $35. It was like a monstrous amount of money, and I don't know what it didn't last long, but that would have been a greater cost or price of a ticket than the price of cost of most bicycles. So finishing off that, getting back to the talking speed. So immoderate riding was, and they issued a lot of tickets, and of course it was just the interpretation of the cops, right? I mean, it's not so far-fetched, because for example in court today, courts do accept, for example, if there's a case of negligence, crash, or a criminal case, they do accept people's estimate of the speed of a car. It's not necessarily accurate, but they do accept they do allow people to testify as to the speed of a vehicle. So this issue, of course, about the speed of bicycles went away because, of course, by the 1920s there were so many cars and there was so much death on the roads. People really focused on cars. So it was not till the 1970s that we got a bylaw that said in the parks, bicycles were limited to 20 kilometers per hour, but everywhere else they could go as fast as they wanted because, of course, you're limited by your muscle strength, and nobody worried about that. Today, that's changing, of course, now with electric bikes. I rented one from Zumo, for example, and I was going about 35 kilometers an hour, and I thought, well, if I fall, I guess that'll be a pretty serious crash. So, but some bicycles, of course, go faster. Others have speed governors on them. But this is going to become a big issue again today, is the speed of bicycles as it was. And I should have mentioned in the 1890s, like between 1898 and 1908, there were 13 people killed by cyclists. I mean, the brakes weren't that good that day, at that time, but people did get killed by bicycles. It does happen today as well. I mean, Niagara on the Lake, there was a woman killed crossing the road by a cyclist. But you'll see, this issue is going to become very topical again, or maybe as well, and we see more and more complaints about that. But that issue has its origin in the 1890s as well. So that's just could obviously go through those topics very quickly because there's a lot more to that. But I did want to leave enough time as well for a discussion on these issues, because not only are they issues that go back to the 1890s, but they're contemporary issues as well. So Jim, if you want to lead us off with a question.
Well, there's a couple of things. As far as licensing goes, in 1968, I was 6 years old. I had my first bicycle, CCM Rambler 500, which I get all choked up when I think about it. To get to use the parking at school, the bike rack, I had to pass an exam and get a CAA, Canadian Automobile Association sticker, but the test was like a riding test, conducted by a police constable, and you weren't allowed to ride your bike to school if you didn't pass that test. Right?
Yeah.
Where was that?
In North York.
Because I'm wondering, because I grew up in North York.
Don
A little
knows.
before you.
Don knows.
I remember something about licenses, and I can picture
They wouldn't
parking,
let-
and I can picture
Yeah,
box.
they wouldn't let you use the bike rack, and there was no other safe place to park your bike around. I mean, even in those days, bike rack was a really major thing, I remember lots of friends of mine having a bike store.
Yeah, it's a great point as well, because I should point out, when licensing is brought up today, it's often in the context people say, well, we want cyclists to, they think it's the driver's license, right? They'll have education, they'll be tested, but that's never what the license is about. The license is really a registration system. So we've had automobile registration since 1903. We had the driver's license was introduced in 1927. And why was the driver's license introduced, and why did the automobile groups, agree to that? It's because at that time there was so much anger about all the people that were being killed by cars. Like, that was a big thing. Like in the 1920s, the number of people being killed. Like, for example, today it's
almost as bad as it is today.
well, no, it was actually much worse then.
Actually,
yeah.
maybe in terms of people being directly killed, but people killed by the automobile industry and the automobile culture, the motorized culture, even motorcycles that disguise themselves as e-bikes, which are motorcycles. They have motors, which is the speed issue again. But all of these things combined, like, they are lethal to thousands of Canadians every year.
Yeah, see, I knew you'd have something to say. Jim is a former bike courier for many years. So I'll say as well that, so what I was getting at, so we did have registration of cars since 1903, but then the license was brought in, and that had some element of testing at the time. In 1927, the idea was to reduce the carnage on the roads. So what happened in the 2 subsequent years, the carnage actually went up, but they had an element of testing, and that's always the confusion today. People think licensing has some element of education and testing, and it doesn't. But the answer really is to put it in schools. I mean, I think kids would love it in schools. Joey is a CAN bike instructor. It's not as popular as it was, or in terms of funding, but put it in schools. But people always confuse those things. When they talk about licensing, all they're talking about is a registration system, and a registration system does not require any testing or education or any of that. And it's not going to happen because governments know that it's hugely expensive to bring in a system like that. So instead of all of that tiresome argument that we go through, so put it in schools, kids would love it, it would teach them skills, and it would increase the legitimacy of cycling just broadly. So,
Just another.
Joey and then Airshot.
So Nova Scotia, up until the mid-1950s, your car, you didn't do a test, at least a driving test. It was literally hey Bob, does Joey here know how to drive a car? Yep, okay, you got your license. And we still have people in Noblesville, probably not now, because they'd be in their 90s, so they'd be retested. But in the 1980s, you had people driving on Nova Scotia highways who didn't have proper training. They just had,
You have plenty of those still today.
yeah.
There's no requirement to take training
No.
to get a driver's license. There's no requirement for any education in driving at all.
Yeah, go ahead,
Pass
finish.
test.
So, going back to cycling here, again, as a cam bike instructor, I can't wait for a program to eventually go into the schools. We were so close in 2018. There was a pilot project that was going to be funded by the province. It was going to start in September 2018. As you all remember, there was an election in June 2018, and that pilot project got unfunded. But if that had gone through, kids would have been taught at the cam bike level 3 and the cam bike level 4 level by grade 9. And so before they were actually driving on the road, they would have proper cycling education to know how to deal with bikes, and then of course how to be good cyclists as well.
Yeah, and I could say, even Jack Layton in 1985, when the Bicycle and the Law Conference recommended cycling education. So this goes back decades. And we always get diverted into talking about licensing, which is confused with education. It has no element of that. Go ahead, Ershon.
Albert, I did have a question in regards to the relationship with the police, law enforcement. So you did talk a lot about the speed limits, right? Also the enforcement in regards to licensing, and it's almost as it seems like bikes were seen like a proper vehicle, like a motor vehicle around that time. And now I'm looking back now, right? Comparing it today, I think there's a lot of those things are still ongoing. In terms of enforcement, we had those big altercations at the High Park last year, where the police officers were radaring and like trying to stop some of these cyclists going over a certain speed limit. But also we talked about in 1920s the carnage on the road, how many people are killed by motorists, and like how detrimental that has been to a lot of people. I'm wondering, did that relationship with the police, as cyclists on the other end, as vulnerable road users, did that ever change, or like, are we still riding the same wave of just policing cyclists as as a threat?
Yeah. So I'm not sure if I understand your question exactly.
The question is, like, do you think that outlook, did they ever change? How the police perceive cyclists as something to manage, control. Or did they ever change to cyclists seen as vulnerable road users?
Yeah.
Something
Well,
that needs to be protected, right?
Yeah, certainly in terms of, for example, when they did the licensing, it was a lot of enforcement against such children. And in fact, I remember this when they talked about police going into schoolyards, and the way the one reporter put it is they're prowling the racks at school. So they officially say we're looking for deficiencies in bikes, but they could also look at whether something had a license. And I do tell the story in the book about one fellow that I talked to. It was like early 50s. So he was riding down Bloor Street, and he saw a cop coming the other way and looking at his bike. So the cop was on a motorcycle, turned around and chased him. And he ducked into a used car lot and sort of hid behind the car, and then escaped. He was like 12 years old. And that sort of relationship was pretty awful. And I think people did get it at the time. You talk about the relationship between the cops and people on bikes. But and some, obviously some got that because it was very awkward. But there were lots of tickets. So there wasn't, I don't think that idea, certainly not when we talk about the 30s, 40s, 50s, that idea of cyclists as vulnerable road users. Go ahead, Todd.
Well, along those lines, there was that story with me sometime in the last month of the woman who placed a complaint with the police department about police cars in the bike lanes, and the response from the police, from the complaints officer was,
Go drink your latte.
yeah, deal with it. We're gonna do whatever we want. So
Also,
the
also-
level of respect and for the cyclist still is limited. And we had the other officer, parking enforcement officer a number of years ago who,
Kyle Ashley.
was it, and he ended up leaving his job because he got too much pushback about the fact that he was actually enforcing the law.
We once called over a cop to, there was somebody in the bike lane parked there, and I was coming along, and there was a cop on the construction site across, I just waved him over, and he says, "What do you want?" I said, "Well, the car's, so what about it?" He just gave me a hard time and then walked back.
Yeah, enforcement is, I mean, if the answer is enforcement, and that does apply to the issue of speed, if the answer is enforcement, then it's not going to happen. But there are things, like who was telling me, John, that your bike has a speed governor on it, right? So, I mean, that issue of speed though, I mean, it's not, you know, as experienced cyclists, but people might say, well, it doesn't really matter. But if you're traveling with kids, for example, through a park, and I know this, for example, going with my nephews, who's like 8, right? I mean, kids go out into the path. They're not, they act like kids. And if someone's going 25 yelling left, left, I mean, kids don't understand that. So that's, there is good reason in parks, because it's not just experienced cyclists and that are using it, but kids and families. And we want to grow cycling. We don't want people to say, I'm not going to cycle because I'm worried about my kids, so I'm just going to stay home and do something else. So it's not something I personally think that we can
Because those
ignore.
are the only ones that are legally allowed in cycle tracks, right, in multi-use path, the kind with the speed limit, the pedal assisting bikes. Any,
Not a problem.
yeah, the one that you have to pedal. They're the only ones allowed in separated cycle tracks and multi.
Yeah, so it's a,
And
it is a
In
distinct.
Toronto,
Yeah.
because they're allowed, that's only regulated by municipal bylaws. So in Mississauga, they're allowed just about anything.
Oh, no, I know, I'm Toronto, I'm talking about Toronto.
Yeah, and it goes back to the issue of enforcement. If the answer is enforcement, then it's not
I
going
think,
to change.
once we get the food courier explosion in 2020, you know, that's, there wasn't ever enforcement before, but now.
Yeah, there's not enforcement, so it has to be a design issue. In other words,
Well,
yeah.
it's like, if it has a motor, it should be treated as a motor vehicle under the Highway Traffic Act, and should be licensed and have to have insurance if it has a motor, electric or
Yeah.
combustion.
And
But
should
if
there
it's a
be any
human
bike
powered,
lanes?
if it's a
shouldn't
human
be a
powered
bike.
vehicle, it's a human's right to get around under their own power. It's not a human right to drive, to get to use a motor, but it's a human right to transport oneself.
I knew you'd have an opinion, Jim.
And I learned from like posters in my hippie brother's bedroom when I was a little kid, speed kills. And all that going fast does is help you catch up.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So I had Peter first, and then
Yeah,
what's your
so-
name again? Nicole.
Yeah, thank you. It was really more about, you know, the explosion of continuing this conversation about, you know, e-bikes. You know, I've seen so many near accidents on the bike paths with these guys flying along. Like I'm going sometimes, maybe going a little bit fast myself, but I'm getting past at 40K. You know, it's crazy. So is there going to be any legislation on that? They're on sidewalks or everywhere. It's just a matter of time before, you know, someone's going to get killed.
I agree with you
Seriously,
100%.
there is.
Yeah. Well, there are, yeah, there are laws that say.
Are they allowed? Are they actually allowed on the bike paths?
Yes,
Like,
they are.
allowed Separated.
They're not supposed
Painted
to.
bike lanes, yes.
There's actually more bikes now, I think, on the electric bikes and scooters.
Yeah.
It's insane.
Yeah. It's an issue that advocates, I mean, have to address, because
Yeah.
someone will get killed, and that will set.
Someone got
cycling
killed a
back.
few weeks ago, one of the riders. You know, he rode into the back of a flatbed truck up on,
Avenue Road.
Didn't run to the
Road.
back, the truck actually turned into it.
Nah, he rode into it because he was looking at his screen instead of looking where he
Oh,
was.
okay, okay,
In fact,
Jim,
there was a
let-
flagging issue where the truck driver didn't even listen to his signing tape, and the off-duty police officer.
Yeah, go ahead, Nicole.
Well, I think it's very interesting. You sort of started this look at the 1890s, because in the 1890s, you had this huge enthusiasm for bikes because compared with horses and walking, like it was such freedom. But then in the 20s, it really seems that the moment we're in now is really a lot more like the 20s, because in the 20s, all of a sudden, you have this new technology, you've got cars And it's crazy, and that's when they had to invent streetlights, directionality, and all these rules, because in fact, new cars just doing every damn thing. And people were getting killed, with licensing, and people didn't even know how to drive. They were like, oh, I'll just try to do this. Oh, we're on the sidewalk now, what do you know? And that's what we're seeing with the electric bikes now, and with the scooters, and all the various motorized, those one-wheel things that they stand on that look like space people. And it feels a lot like we're sort of back in the 20s situation where there is no real consensus on how any of this should be handled, where things should be, how we can do it. And we're seeing in terms of the biking infrastructure, where we're trying to get the biking infrastructure up, and yet they keep sort of changing the way things are signaled, like, is there going to be a streetcar stop? Well, sometimes it's going to be a green thing, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes we're doing a bumpy thing, and sometimes we're just not even going to say, oh, yes, sign. There's no real standardization, and it's a lot like early driving. So, it is true that, like, if you look at the 1890s, you had this enthusiasm, but really it seems to me that kind of it is the 20s that you have these huge parallels with our current situation. What do you think we can learn, like, if we compare how these changes were handled in the 20s, like what they did well and what they did bad, how we can apply that to cycling now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, that problem of the danger of cars wasn't solved. Because, I mean, just to give you an example, in the 50s and 60s, 1964, 135 people were killed that would have been Metro, 135. Today, we're rightly upset and angry that 60 people are killed per year. So it didn't get any better until we finally said, with Vision Zero, like up until that point, it was like, well, that's kind of the cost of modern transportation. It really didn't get much attention. And if you look at what Fred Gardner did, he widened the roads, speed got heavier. That was his world. It never got solved ever until we started saying, well, you shouldn't have to pay. They shouldn't cost you your life for making a mistake, right? Because if you make a mistake, the roads should be designed to prevent that from becoming fatal. And that's sort of a total switch in thinking. And also in terms of the speed limits, then we said 30, and that was controversial, right? 30 and 40, right? 30 for residential, 40. When that was first proposed, I was involved in that. It was like, there was such a backlash against it. They said, well, that's ridiculous, but people wanted it because they understood that. And they've understood that since the 1890s. I remember there was a headline that said, cars go too fast, good for the tombstone men. And so they understood that cars were dangerous, but it didn't get solved. It didn't get solved until.
Both in terms of how the infrastructure is, but also in how cars were made, right? Like seat belts.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I remember, I'm not so old, but like, seat belts were completely optional, theoretical thing until really the 80s.
And they're taking away our freedom.
And it was just, and then they actually said, no, look, you got the seat belts. This is very
Safer they make
dangerous.
the inside of a car, the more dangerous it becomes for everyone else.
But so similarly, like with the throttle bikes, like at what point, do we mandate like, well, this is the kind of motor you can even have, and this is what you can have. And if you have a motor, the brakes have to actually be able to like, at what point does that get legislated to make them safe?
Well, and that's in the process, and I think it's as advocates, we're gonna have to do that and not say, well, cars are worse. Like, nobody wears a t-shirt and says, I'd rather get hit by a car, but that's kind of the attitude I see a lot. That don't worry about it, cars are worse. But if you're in a park with your children, that's not good enough that cars are worse. You just don't want to get hit. But I don't know exactly the answer, but I'm definitely going to think more about it. But let's, right here, you had a question?
Yeah, really just to follow up on the last two questions. What level of government are we talking about putting the pressure on here in terms of these e-bikes? Because they're ridiculous.
Federal is design, right? Provincial is operation, and the city gets its power from the province. So all three levels of government. And I know when the city has recently done its micro-mobility strategy, I mean, they're trying to work with the federal government to get some kind of regulation. But we're seeing not only a huge dramatic surge in the number of cyclists, but the number of vehicles that we have, like e-scooters and different types of motorbikes or whatever you call them, or other bikes. And some of them go quite fast. They're going 45. So you might have a speed governor, but a lot don't. But that's also a sales thing in terms of what we allow to be sold.
Well, legally, they all have to have the governor. We can't go above 32 kilometers an hour.
Yeah.
But they're easily defeated.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
I just want to know what people here think of the Cafe TO, those orange candlestick bollards that actually intrude into the space even more than the regular barrier. And between the streetcar tracks and potholes and that, these bikes have about this much room. Very dangerous, and cars and streetcars trying to compete, and the bike squeezed in, so.
Phil, did you have an answer?
Yeah, just what he said. I was on Danforth the other day, last year, going on between Coxville and Maine. They have those patios.
Yeah.
So what the owner was, they extended the patio. So you're on your bike path going east, and they got these planter boxes. You're going like 60 or 40. You go dead on.
60 or 40, you're going too fast.
But still, you got to stop with the bike at the planter box. You got to go around the patio.
But there's no monitoring.
But the bike path's been blocked off by the patio, right?
Also the angles in which you have to make.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Even if they go slow, you gotta stop at that planter box. They gotta go around the patio. I phoned the city up and they reported them because they extended past the bike lane, the patio, which is illegal.
All the city needs is one person to go up and down
And that's
and
quite a few doing
monitor.
that right now.
Yeah, there's too many.
There's nobody monitoring it, unless you report it.
Go ahead, do you have a question?
May I have a few? So, Mike, the gist of what I'm getting is that you're opposed to all forms of individual licensing, but you're in favor of licensing at a higher level. So, what kinds of licensing what kind of regulations would you impose on manufacturers, dealers, and app companies, and who would do them?
Okay, well, that's in fact what the city's asked for right now, is in terms of a courier, so to license the couriers, the courier companies. I mean, the courier companies call themselves, they always say, oh, we're not actually a courier company, we're a telephone answering service.
Right.
Some things like that. But so they're gonna have to get around that, but they're gonna have to ask the province for the power to do that. And they have asked for that in terms of the courier company. So that's, if you could license the courier companies like Foodora, well, no longer Foodora, they took off. But they took off once the workers got the right to unionize. But like Uber Eats and DoorDash and so on. So once you regulate the companies, it's like any other courier company. Then you put the responsibility on them for what their couriers are doing. Are they going too fast? Are they riding on the sidewalks? Well, whatever it is. I mean, that's far superior to doing an individual licensing system, which is not going to happen because it's too expensive.
And that comes from the province,
That would come from the province,
which
yes.
isn't really going to happen under Dougie.
Yeah. Well, it might not happen now, but we're 2 years away from an election, so it's possible to happen at the other. But it might be that he would allow the city to license the app companies. Why wouldn't he? I mean, it's, right?
Well, why haven't they done it yet then?
Well, they're just asking for it now. It's the first time they've asked. It's just recently. So the motion actually initially that the Infrastructure Environment Committee passed was to ask the province for the power to license couriers. And so that there was pushback to that, and now they're saying we want the power to license the companies, and council did pass that. So go ahead. Maybe we should probably get, what time is it now? I know we're going to...
Exactly.
Oh, perfect. Okay, well, the last question, and then we'll stick around, and you can certainly buy a book. Ask me a question. Any of that, but we'll end with this last question, and I'm not sure what time Fred needs to close up.
I'm going to love that we're ending with me, because I wanted to switch the conversation a fair bit, because y'all are talking a lot about very particular advocacy and policy dimensions. But what I'm more interested in is how do we facilitate a culture of using the bicycle or other means of micromobility as legitimate, accepted, forms of transportation that everybody can do. And so I wondered if your book talked a little bit more about those cultural dimensions rather than just the advocacy and policy dimensions.
Yeah. Well, the book is intended to be an advocacy tool, right? To give you the information about the history. Because one of the things that, part of the reason inspired me to write the book is that we don't have any knowledge, very little knowledge as advocates. So we might know in our personal experience, going back 3 years, 5 years, but once we start going 10 years, we don't have much memory, less so 20 years or 30 years ago. But if, for example, if you look at the 1970s, we were where we are today, except for climate change. So in the 1970s, we had concern about the environment, we had concern about fitness, and air pollution and so on. And today, all of that is the same again. So we don't have that institutional knowledge as cyclists or cycling advocates. So it doesn't talk that much about the culture, but it does give you that information about the history to use that as a tool. But I would say it's a really important issue about, you know, in terms of the culture where we're going at now, because we want to grow cycling. And if we see cycling as just something that experienced people do, which was kind of behind what was the vehicular cycling. Who was talking in the 1980s? The vehicular cyclists were the experienced cyclists, right? Because they were really the only organized groups at the time. So for example, the Couriers, Jim, and but mostly like the Canadian Wheelmen's Association, which had become the Canadian Cycling Association. They were the experienced people. So they had the say and were very influential at the time. But I'd say today, so if we're talking about culture, we want to grow things. We don't simply want to replicate like kind of the oppressive car-based model where you go out there and you take your chances. We want a kinder, gentler world, but we want to keep expanding that. And so that's why I think these issues of understanding issues around speed is really important, because we want to grow cycling. We need to listen to people who are not shouting and not talking very loudly, but they want the bike paths and the bike trails to be safe for everyone. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a bigger question. We can talk about it later. So let's end there, and but we're around so we can chat more. And I don't see that the bar is open anymore. But we can certainly chat very more. So I do want to end just by thanking each of you for. I mean, many of you are advocates in the work that you've done, and I'm hoping that the book will be a useful advocacy tool to you, and I'm also hoping that you'll find it's a very rich history that we're part of as cyclists today, going back at least 130 years. So thanks to each of you for coming.
Where do we get the books?
Well, Fred is selling them. Is Fred behind the counter somewhere? You can actually buy one here.
I think Fred left.
Yeah,
But someone's got to lock the door, right?